Hi, thank you all for inviting me. It feels really nice to be presenting at UNESCO. My name is Rossi. I'm from Mumbai, India, and the title of my talk is The Social Model of Disability and Critical Mathematics Education. So this talk is a summary of my research work, or rather it is a subset of a summary of my research work. So in this talk, I will be presenting about the social model of disability and critical mathematics education. So to understand what is a social model of disability, we have to juxtapose it with what Michael Oliver refers to as the individual model of disability. So basically, the traditional understanding of disability is that the problem faced by disabled people is a consequence of their disability. Now, the social model of disability, which was framed by members of the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, they had written in their fundamental principles document that it is society which disables physically impaired people. The disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by a contemporary social organization which takes no or little account of people who have physical impairments and thus excludes them from participation in the mainstream of social activities. The social model of disability is underpinned by a historical materialist critique of society, of a capitalist society. So Roddy Sklorak, who defends the social model, he says that what we know as impairment was likely to have been understood and dealt with very differently in earlier human societies. And the current form of discrimination came into existence with the rise of capitalist society and the Industrial Revolution that would demand a new type of labor, which led to the rise of disability as a specific form of discrimination. So Sklorak also gives the example of spinning machines which were designed for the use of the average human being for maximum productivity. So therefore, bodies that would not conform to the so-called average body would be constructed as being different. And also, Roddy, he mentions different examples of physically impaired human beings who lived across different human societies and different historical epochs, citing the examples of people who had lived with disabilities even in pre-class societies. And recently there was this article of a Neanderthal man who was known to be disabled, but then a reanalysis of the 50,000-year-old Neanderthal skull showed that in addition to enduring many injuries and debilitations, this male individual was also profoundly deaf. Yet he lived into his 40s, which is quite old by Paleolithic standards. It's an achievement that could only have been possible with the help of others, according to new research. So this research actually showed that the notion of empathy was very old, but today there is so much of, say, individualism, and atomization of people into individuals. And the social model of disability, although it was framed in the 70s, the ideas that support it have been there for a while. For example, in 1920, in her book The Modern Woman, Helen Keller had stated that the blind man, however poignantly his individual suffering appeals to our hearts, is not a single separate person whose problem can be solved by itself, but a symptom of social maladjustment. So to talk about the social model of disability, I argue that the social model of disability inverts the relationship between disability and exclusion by showing that the reified disability is the effect of exclusion and not the cause. I use the word reified in the context of reification, which means that a process takes the form of a thing, and by addressing that process as that thing, the process is reproduced. So for example, in the context of disability and education, I would say that it is not that students are excluded because they have disabilities, but rather students are disabled through the process of exclusion, and their exclusion is rationalized by blaming them for having the thing called disability. So when I talk about being disabled, it's being disabled from, say, disabled from learning mathematics. So students are not disabled, they are not excluded from mathematics because they have disabilities, but rather they are excluded from learning mathematics and therefore they are disabled from learning mathematics in that way. So Michael Oliver also, he mentions in this way, a social organization does not discriminate equally against all physical impairments, and thus there arises the appearance of degrees of exclusion, degrees of disability, to which I would say put it as degrees of exclusion appears as degrees of disability. Now, what could this mean for education? So, for that, I will talk about some of my field observations. So, my field work was conducted at this Vivek Education Foundation School for Blind Children, in which, as being a guitarist, a musician, I was offered to engage with the children for 2 hours on Saturdays every week. But as time progressed, we would also volunteer to teach the children for their exams. And it was quite common that the students would digress from what was being discussed to their personal experiences of being discriminated against. So, for example, Rani was mentioning about her experience in a school in which she was studying. And she was saying that I don't play with them. They think that this will happen to her, that will happen to her. That's why I'm made to sit separately. What I feel, if someone is blind, it's not their fault. I have received sports medals. I showed that in school. Even still, they would not know that in her there is talent. Now, it might seem not so surprising that that Rani was discriminated against. She was blind. She faced discrimination, and there's a lot of literature which says that blind people face discrimination in schools. But Rani continued. She says, "My school before this was very good. I did not at all feel any different. And even Rudra, who is another student of the study center, they cooperate. And right in front, they keep me, like in sports, etc. And anytime if anything happens, and sir tells me, in this school, so much discrimination doesn't happen." Now, it was very interesting to note that Rani was not excluded in her old school, but she was excluded in her new school. Rani was blind in both the schools. Both the schools were normal schools. Neither schools had assistive technologies or teachers who could teach Braille. So it was quite evident that it was a process of exclusion in her new school, which was a private school, that was made to appear as Rani's disability. So Rani was blind in both the schools, in the government school as well as in the private school, but because she was excluded from learning in the private school, and it was made to appear that she is being excluded because of her disability, rather than the other way around, rather than she being disabled from learning owing to being excluded, which was not the case in the government school. Now, what could this imply for mathematics education? So for this, I would give some more examples of the mathematics sessions we had taken at the Vivek Education Foundation Study Center, which is called School for the Blind, but I refer to it as the center. So we had started off with discussions on what are the students' difficulties, and then finally we narrowed down on discussing divisibility. So I started off with odd and even numbers, and after a brief discussion, I posed a question: is 1,234 odd or even? To which Rani replied immediately, 617. She divided the number by 2. And then other students also were a little bit lost. They were trying to do the same thing. But then I tried to move on by saying that, well, because we had discussed about looking at the units place and all of that, but still the students would prefer to actually divide the number by 2. So then I posed a bigger number, a huge number, just so that to get the point across that you don't need to divide a number by 2. So I give the number which comprises of 10 threes and a 0 and asked, is it odd or even? But now students were still trying to divide it by 2. Rani would divide it by 2, and then there were discussions among the children about how big the number is, how would you divide such a big number? And all attempts to move ahead with the discussion was actually resisted by the children by basically ignoring me. So until all their friends would be responding and would be part of the discussion. So in this classroom, it was interesting that there were children of varied age groups, right, from age 8 to age 18. And one student was profoundly deaf, she was mentally challenged, and she was blind, and still she was being part of the discussions. Very often she would feel shy to present her views to the class, so she would present it to my friend who would present her views to the class. So in this case, in this way, it was rather remarkable, because in the beginning I thought that if there are such a range of disabilities and so such a varied group of children, then obviously some children would be left behind. But that really wasn't the case, because when you talk about critical maths education, we have to talk about making it democratic. But then what could it mean to have a democratic classroom when there is such a varied group of people? But of course that did not really come into play. So later on, I had moved on to say to subtractions. So, and then I I was give some examples and try to get the children to do these subtractions, and I would get a little bit annoyed that some children would not participate. And then one student, Faizan, he was saying that he was giving an example of his friends and saying that, if you look at his friend Sheikh, who had dropped out from school in third standard because he lost his eyesight. Then he went through a long depression and then came back to school, and now he's pursuing his 10th standard directly, but without taking mathematics. So he said, I would have to teach from the basics. But then I said, well, no, look, you get the idea. I just want you to get the idea of subtraction. And then Faizan says, well, look, see, they have the idea. But what I was doing was, he was saying that he was pointing out that I was just giving them 2 numbers to subtract with. Faizan was saying 3 numbers are required for subtraction. And he was saying if all 3 are given, then he will be able to do it. And in practice, he was saying all factors are present. How much should be subtracted? How much change should be returned? How much is there with the buyer of a particular product? All these factors are there. So Faizan was saying that if you want to do subtraction, you need to give 3 numbers. For example, the amount of money you give to the shopkeeper, the price of a commodity, and the amount of change you receive back. And seeing how much change you receive back, the shopkeeper will keep on giving more change until you have a balance. So 3 numbers are required for subtraction, not 2. That's what there was a discussion about. When I moved on to odd and even numbers again, the number 0 came about, on which the students arrived at a consensus that 0 is both odd and even. So it is because based on our definition, 0 leaves no remainder when divided by 2, thus 0 is even. But when we have 0, we have nothing to divide by 2. So you cannot divide 0 by 2 because there's nothing to divide. So 0 is odd because definition of odd is a number that cannot be divided by 2. Well, 0 cannot be divided by 2, so it is odd. And then, but then Faizan said that numbers have the property that odd plus or minus odd is even, even plus or minus even is odd, is even, and odd plus or minus even is odd. Now 3 minus 3 is 0, so 0 is best categorized as even and not odd. And then in the next session, when I try to revise the odd and even and proceed further, then there was a discussion that, well, even numbers have the property that if you keep dividing by 2, you reach an odd number. Now this does not happen with 0, so 0 is a special even number. No matter how much I try to convince them that 0 is an even number, the students would resist. They would say, no, 0, I mean, you can say it's an even number, but it has to be a special even number. You cannot call it an even number. For exams, we'll agree that it's an even number, but really it is actually a special even number. When I moved on to negative numbers, they were not really engaged with it until we had a discussion about where did numbers like -1, -2 come from. So Faizan says, there has to be a reason, like we did for odd and even numbers. When we found that we can divide some number of ice creams by 2, we call them even numbers. Otherwise, we call them odd numbers. So where would these -1, -2 numbers come from? Then he hypothesized that he recalled that, well, when we were in the mall, we saw -1, -2 to represent the basements. But then he went on to think aloud and says, but negative numbers are very old, malls are very new. So he hypothesized that maybe in the Harappan civilization where there was underground, some water channels that had to be replaced and all, that's where my negative numbers could have come from. But just to summarize, I would say that one of my observations of this study center was that the spirit of cooperation and empathy dominated over rivalry and competition. So very often in other settings, there would be a spirit of rivalry and competition. But here it was cooperation and empathy. So the whole question of having a democratic classroom when there is such a varied group of children, I mean, that was actually, it was actually taken care of. The students ensured that the mathematics learning was democratic. And another point was that students themselves worry and participate in the project of inclusion. So, but now when you move on to critical mathematics education, my observation was that the students did not merely adapt themselves to my mathematics teaching, but through their interaction with mathematics, they redefined the very meaning of mathematics education and what it means to learn mathematics. The students did not approach mathematics as a reified thing to be accessed or learned or constructed, but as a process with which to creatively engage with. And through this process, mathematics could not serve as an instrument of or justification for exclusion and a consequent reification of disablement. So I would say that in the context of critical mathematics education, now CME is not to be used as a reified thing to be applied to a classroom, but a process through which we engage critically with mathematics education and with critical mathematics education as well. For example, there might be a lot of statements which for example, Ole might make that we may not agree with, but that does not delegitimize critical mathematics education, but it calls for a critical engagement. So there is a space for reflexivity even within critical mathematics education, which I found very powerful in the context of teaching blind children. So, and also another point is that students are not recipients of either inclusion or critical maths education, but active learners and partners in the struggle against exclusionary forces that produce disabilities and that serve the capitalist economy. Thank you.